Well, it kind of ties into a second question. In one of your videos, you said that you no longer think we're in the business of changing values, that we change skills, that's the point. And that really stuck with me because, in part, because I'm trying to figure out the type of workshops I want to do with people. And as a psychologist, I'm in the business of changing values a lot of the time. So that's a really different. So it leads me to wonder how much time do you make for the macro level group process in the workshops? And I think you're going to say it depends on the level that they're at. And then also, where do you see the line between skills training and psychology? Like, have you bumped up against that? Because the work you're talking about now could lead to some really deep, like, shifts in personality or consciousness, or right?
Yes. So whether I'm doing training or executive coaching, mm-hmm. or the year of transformation work, which is ongoing mentoring, I say that I have a pretty strong boundary between the work that I do and therapy. And the metaphor, so again, you said psychology, so I don't know how that's different, so I might ask you a question here. But
therapy's great. Yeah.
Okay. So this metaphor was actually Dr. Martha Beck, where I did the coach training I did. Something like when you are, you've got the flu or you think you have a bacterial infection, you go to a doctor to get antibiotics. Or, you broke an ankle, you go to a doctor and you get some deeper healing. Coaching and training is kind of like being when you go to a gym and they have personal trainer, there it is. We're kind of like personal trainers. People are in pretty good shape and they want to improve. We're not doing deeper healing. It's not physical therapy, occupational therapy. So I don't know if any of those metaphors work for folk. That was very helpful for me because I was not trained as a therapist, but I sure had enough counseling, and I was in student affairs. And so we did coaching, counseling. It was a little more blurred in student affairs, at least when I was doing it. So the way I engage is probably deeper emotional work than some coaches and trainers, just because I feel I have the capacity. Okay, back to your point. The reason I talked about, I believe, our responsibility and our boundary is about changing behavior that's aligned with the organizational stated values. So it's not my personal values. I'm not putting them on people. I'm not trying to change your personal values. But within this organization, they have said this is what we are about. And so self-awareness, consciousness raising, attitudinal shifts, maybe, and clearly behaviors that help the organization serve the increasingly diverse client base, minimize microaggressions, shift implicit bias so that we're not doing hiring that's based on our mindset of who we want to hire, that's usually white, upper class privilege. So those, I think, attitudes and behaviors are clearly up for negotiation, shifting within the organizational's strategic initiatives. Where this all comes from is, as a lesbian, 35 years ago when I started in homophobia work, I don't know if people around me or I was like, I need to change these people. They are so homophobic. I need to change their beliefs, their values. And I just talk about the walls of resistance. So as a strategy, I would talk about an inclusive work environment to dismantle homophobia, to interrupt dynamics. And I'd say things like, you might still believe that me as a lesbian or being gay or bisexual is wrong. And I believe we can be in a work environment of respect and mutual dignity and work together effectively to serve our customers and our clients. Whether I really, really believe that or not, but the truth is, folks of color every day are working with whites like me who still have racial biases and racial prejudice. And hopefully we find a way, usually pretty effectively, to work together. And I know men still have sexist dynamics. So how do I know that I can take care of myself and name dynamics if I feel a bump, and give folks in the privileged identities where I'm marginalized some grace that they're showing up the best they can, as folks give me as a white person or some class privilege? I'm continually. So I don't know if that getting anywhere close to what you were asking. So why don't you come on back in and see what you think?
Yeah, it does. I mean, those are all the things I'm teasing out. And so then I think if in a skills building workshop, a white person is starting to have an awakening, there is a shift in values potentially that is happening that we could go for, that I think I would feel the like snag of that and wanting to move towards that. And so I'm wondering what you do in those moments when you feel that shift, or do you just back off and trust they're in their process and then move forward with the skills building, or do you go for it?
So you've probably seen all the materials. I would call it's awareness and skill building is a lot of what I do. Mm-hmm. So if they're having an epiphany, a self-awareness of like, oh, I get now, my parents had racist attitudes. Oh my God. I mean, is that the kind of moment you're in? Like, sure. Or can you give me an example? Okay.
No, that's great.
So then I might, if they're like big emotion, I may go there, but I might go, oh, I remember that moment. Anybody else remember the moment you realized? So I go to me and the group. So I'm kind of on pairs. I'm doing a little share, but I'm also giving them a little bit of a moment if they don't want to be this emotional, which is fine if they do. Oh, I remember just the pain and the shock. Anybody else remember? How are you doing? And then come back and how are you doing? Do you want to say more about what awareness you're getting to? So I would make a little space, and someone might call that moving into, closer to the line of therapy counseling. But I would probably rationalize it as that's the kind of self-awareness we're wanting from people in their privileged identities. It's along that cycle of socialization, if you've found any of that material yet, of, I grew up in a family where I'm just realizing the school I went to, the books were all about whites, and I was taught people were happy on reservations. They were, they were happy picking grapes in California. They were grateful for the work. I didn't see how I was taught some xenophobic, racist things. So that level of out of denial into very early awareness, which in some, it might be weeks 16 or 17, we'll get to it's the path to competence. And it's a pretty shocking, that realization of my world is getting blown up right now and shattering. And so folks, if we're training and we're present in our bodies and we're really connected to the person, we can get some clues. If they're wanting to do more, sometimes I'll do things like process the process. So that sounds like a real new awakening for you, or a real new realization. Am I right? My guess is you might be feeling a little shock or like, how could that be? How'd I miss it? So I'm doing some of those. I don't have the metaphor, but I'm kind of throwing out possibilities to see which ones they might agree to. So they don't have to talk a lot, but they're like, yeah. And then you want to say more. So I'm a little cautious because sometimes when folks get that deep, they may go places publicly they're not ready to. And I'm seeing you nod. So the therapist in you and the almost counselor in me. So I think I do unconsciously relate in who else relates so they know they're not alone. Validate. This is, for me, that was a really difficult moment when I realized my mom was telling racist jokes because that's not what I believe my mom to be. What's that like? Do you want to talk at all anymore? So I'll offer, do you want to say any more about what you're going through right now? And if not, that's cool. So I even give them that. So I give them two choices. I say, because there are other people in the room who can talk about what it's like. So what do you think of those ideas?
Yeah, as I'm hearing you talk, I'm thinking, I mean, they're great ideas. And also, if it's a diverse group that I'm working with, then it also runs the risk of becoming about developing a white racial identity instead of potentially the topic of inclusivity in the work. So that feels like another one of those boundaries. Like that would be good therapy group material, white racial identity development, and, or maybe that's a topic that we pick up in a subgroup or something, but we get the focus back.
So what's your concern if you spend time looking at white kind of epiphanies, moving from denial into, what's your concern? Can you say a little bit more?
Yeah, that it becomes a group on inclusivity for white people. That same white supremacy mentality is taken over the group process. So we're no longer talking about the shared experience or diverse experiences that we're trying to include into the conversation.
Mm-hmm. So you're envisioning a workshop that's breadth of differences, inclusion in general. Mm-hmm. So I appreciate that. And I have a couple thoughts, as always.
Great.
One is, given this national context, 2019, I am finding generally folks of color are wanting to talk about race more and seem appreciative when whites get honest and vulnerable. Now, I could be wrong in your setting. Compared to 3 years ago when I didn't see race, while I might think I'm centering race, I'm finding participants, particularly of color, indigenous, multiracial, biracial, my assessment, the cumulative impact, the onslaught, the barrage of racism and white supremacy for years, but also particularly since Ferguson, and just the ineptness and the rise of mainstreaming of Nazis and white supremacists in the White House and other places on our media. So I actually watch the group and I follow the leadership of folk of color. But I am finding I have more room to have racism, more how we learn about privilege and marginalized, and not necessarily having to do the full breadth as much. Huge statement, but that's where I've been the last few months. And as whites are having this conversation, as I guess you do, you could say, I'm noticing how much we're talking about kind of whites coming into awareness around race. I'm wondering what the impact of this conversation is on other folks in the room. It's a gentle way of inviting folks of color in. I might even say on folks of color, but that could be a bump. I'm just saying. So just noticing for the last 4 or 5 voices, we've had whites in the room. I'm curious, anybody else want in, or is it a little more indirect way? And you just test and see. Another way to go to say, process the process and say, what have you all noticed we've been doing? Now, race has been the content we've been talking about, but what have you noticed we've been doing for the last 5 or so minutes? And someone might say, someone in their privileged identity has very vulnerably and honestly said they were getting some new insights about some privileged socialization that they weren't realizing, so they might be able to summarize it. And then you could say, I'm wondering if anybody else on another topic of diversity can relate to a time, it may have been 20 years ago, or it may have been recently, but a time when you realized, in your privileged identity, pull out the group identity cards, just kind of flip through, and how can you relate to what so-and-so has been talking about on a different category of difference? So you're inviting folks in, any identity, but you're watching, at least I'd be watching to see if any person of color wants to come in, because I believe in my soul that as we are able across race to all own our privilege and our marginalized all at the same time, that's the way we can more effectively really move forward. And in this moment in time in the US and the world, asking folks of color to own their privilege is particularly difficult and challenging in my experience, because there is so much pain and trauma, generations as well as current, and there are so few whites showing up to do this work. So that's kind of where I am today, and I might do that. And even if it's a white person that comes in and a man comes in and says, when I realized how sexist my dad was or my uncle, so, and then I might come up, let's have a few more who relates into that, and how about one more category of difference? Could be a way, but I'll come back to you, Cole, to address your wanting to open it up to all voices. And it is so rare that whites show up vulnerable, owning an aha and awareness that it might really be just ask, what's the impact of hearing this white person do this? Or these last few minutes of several whites talking about times they were in denial and maybe moved to shock and kind of shattered. That could be a phenomenal conversation across race. And And then the debrief might be, what was the impact of doing this? And could you imagine continuing these conversations about other identities? We're done with our time today, but could you imagine if we came back and talked about, say, sex assigned at birth, sexuality, class, and for folks with class privilege to talk about when they realized they had class privilege and they actually had classist attitudes and maybe people they cared about perpetuated classism. What's that like to really realize you and others are perpetuating a system of oppression that you thought you were pretty good around? What's that like?